By the time 1944 rolled around, everyday life inside Germany felt like somebody had dropped the whole country into a pressure cooker and cranked the heat all the way up. Because the average German wasn't waking up to a normal morning anymore. They were waking up to the sound of air raid sirens screaming through the dawn like hell's own alarm clock, diving out of bed, grabbing whatever they could carry, and sprinting down cold stairwells into bomb shelters already packed with families that looked more like shadows than human beings. And every time those bombs hit, the ground shook so hard you could feel the vibrations in your teeth, dust raining from the ceiling while mothers pulled their kids close and dads tried to pretend they weren't terrified, even though their eyes were telling the real story. And when they finally crawled out into the daylight again, the streets didn't look like streets anymore. They looked like the aftermath of some giant cosmic fight, with entire apartment blocks flattened, roofs peeled back like tinfoil, churches sliced in half, and those Nazi flags that used to flap around like they owned the place now lying in dirty puddles, half burnt and torn to shreds. Which honestly kinda said everything about how the war was going. Food? Forget it. People were trading coffee grounds like gold dust, stretching a loaf of bread like it was supposed to feed an army, boiling weeds from the roadside just to feel like they were eating something warm. And half the time, the potatoes they found were rotten or frozen solid, but they cooked them anyway because hunger didn't care. Hunger just kept chewing at your spine. And while women stood in endless lines hoping for a scrap of meat, old folks shuffled around carrying little sacks of coal that wouldn't last a night. Young boys, barely old enough to shave, were saluting local party officers like they were soldiers. And behind every door, someone whispered rumors about the Americans coming, the British tightening the skies, the Soviets rolling in with vengeance in their pockets. Because everybody knew the war was turning against them, even though the Nazi radio announcers kept shouting that victory was right around the corner. Shouting so loud it felt like they were trying to shout over the sound of reality blowing up all around them. The Gestapo, they were everywhere, creeping, lurking, eavesdropping like paranoid wolves, and people were terrified to even sigh too loud in case someone reported them for defeatist attitude, which is a fancy way of saying not pretending you're still excited about a war that's clearly kicking your country in the teeth. And late at night, when mothers sat by dim candles sewing socks for sons who might never come home, when old men stared out cracked windows listening to distant artillery thunder like rolling doom, when kids asked simple painful questions like, "Why is the sky always on fire?" That's when the weight of it all really settled in, the realization that the world they'd been promised wasn't coming back, that the Reich wasn't rising, but sinking, and everybody felt it deep in their bones, this slow, creeping dread that tomorrow would be worse than today. Because in 1944 Germany wasn't a nation marching proudly forward. It was a nation trying desperately not to drown under the crushing weight of a war that had finally come home. By mid-1944, the vibe inside Germany had gone from "we got this" to "oh hell, we're in trouble" so fast it gave the whole country emotional whiplash, because every corner of society was cracking under the strain. Factories were running on fumes. Workers were pulling insane shifts with barely any food in their stomachs. Machines were breaking down so often that engineers were basically performing mechanical CPR every day just to squeeze out one more batch of ammo or tank parts.
and the higher-ups kept barking orders like everything was fine, even though everyone, from the machinist to the janitor, knew the war was draining them dry. And while all that was happening, the Nazi leadership was acting like a fever dream. Goebbels was pumping out speeches talking about total war, like it was some kind of motivational slogan, instead of admitting the country was stretched thinner than a paper napkin in a rainstorm. And Hitler was tucked away in his bunker, reading maps like they were going to magically change if he stared at them long enough, flipping out at generals, denying reality, and making decisions that even his own officers whispered were straight-up crazy. Meanwhile, the civilians were the ones eating the consequences. You had entire towns where the only people left were old women, teenage boys, and kids who should have been in school, but were instead collecting scrap metal, helping put out fires from the air raids, or running messages between offices because there weren't enough adults left to do it. And at night, when the bombers came again, and they always came again, families crowded in cellars with stale air that smelled like dirt, sweat, and fear, listening to the thunder overhead while a single candle flickered against trembling walls. And after the raids, you'd see people climbing through rubble with shovels and bare hands, praying they wouldn't find someone they loved under the debris, but knowing deep down that eventually everyone found someone. And while all this chaos swallowed the cities, farmers were dealing with their own nightmare. Fields abandoned because the men were at the front, cows underfed, tools broken, barns hit by stray bombs, and the government kept demanding more grain, even though there wasn't any more to give. So people started stealing food straight from the fields, or bartering with whatever they had left, an old coat, a wedding ring, a family heirloom, anything that could buy a few carrots or a handful of flour. Morale wasn't just low, it was buried 6 feet under. But no one dared say it out loud, because the Gestapo had turned paranoia into a lifestyle, dragging people away for jokes, complaints, or even just sounding tired. And everyone lived with that sick, twisting worry in their stomachs that one wrong comment would make them disappear. And through it all, the sound of the Eastern Front kept rumbling closer, like some unstoppable monster crawling across Europe. And German civilians kept hearing horror stories, towns swallowed overnight, families fleeing on foot, refugees pouring in with frostbitten hands and haunted eyes, muttering about how the Red Army was coming fast and wasn't in a forgiving mood. And that fear seeped into every street, every apartment, every whispered conversation behind closed doors, until even the die-hard believers started realizing the truth. The war wasn't something happening out there anymore. The war was coming straight for them, and there was no propaganda, no speeches, no slogans left strong enough to hold back the terror of what tomorrow might bring.
By late 1944, Germany wasn't just struggling, it was straight up unraveling, coming apart stitch by stitch, while the people trapped inside it tried to act like they weren't watching the whole country bleed out in real time. And you could see it everywhere, man, from the cities that looked like someone dropped the world's angriest meteor on them, to the rural villages where the silence felt heavier than artillery shells, because everyone knew the front lines were inching closer, like some slow-moving shadow you could feel creeping up your spine. And inside that tension, the government kept doubling down on insanity. handing out those People's Storm Volkssturm armbands to old guys who needed canes and teenage boys who still had homework, shoving rusty rifles into their hands and telling them to be heroes, even though most of them couldn't even fire straight. And deep down, they knew the whole thing was a suicide mission dressed up as patriotism. Meanwhile, schools weren't really schools anymore. Classrooms echoed with empty seats because half the boys had been drafted into Hitler Youth combat units, and half the girls were working long shifts in munitions plants, their hands blistered and blackened from gunpowder, while posters on the walls yelled stuff like "Victory is certain," which would have been funny if it wasn't so damn tragic, because anybody with functioning eyeballs could see victory was slipping farther away every single day. And in the homes that still had roofs, families lived with this twisted routine: wake up, check the sky for bombers, stand in line for hours hoping the bakery had something that wasn't sawdust bread, carry buckets of water from public pumps because pipe networks were busted, then spend the night huddled in basements, listening to bombs scream overhead, praying they wouldn't be the next name added to the civilian casualties the radio always read off with that weird robotic tone, like they weren't talking about real people. Black markets exploded everywhere, and the crazy part? They weren't even subtle anymore. People were meeting in alleyways, trading butter for boots, soap for cigarettes, medicine for jewelry, because regular money had become this useless paper you kept out of habit, while actual survival ran on favors and whatever scraps you could haggle for. And all the while, more and more refugees from the east poured in, dragging wagons stacked with whatever they could carry: blankets, chipped dishes, a family Bible, maybe a scared-looking dog. And when they stumbled into towns, they didn't talk loud, didn't brag, didn't ask questions. They just mumbled horror stories about entire neighborhoods burned down, people frozen on the roads, families split up in the chaos, Soviet tanks crushing everything in their path, and that fear spread faster than wildfire. Even the die-hard Nazi fanatics started losing their cool. Party officials were suddenly stuttering when giving speeches. Officers had eyes that twitched like rabbits being hunted. And the soldiers on leave who came home for a few days looked so haunted it was like they'd aged 10 years in 10 weeks, sitting at kitchen tables, staring into space, saying nothing, because how do you tell your family what you just saw? And beneath it all, the German public felt this massive, suffocating pressure, like the air itself was getting heavier, because they weren't just living through a war anymore. They were living through a collapse, a slow-motion fall, where every day felt like another brick dropping out of the wall. And nobody knew which day would be the one where everything came crashing down for good.
By the time winter tightened its icy grip at the end of 1944, Germany felt less like a nation and more like a giant, exhausted body running on its last heartbeat. Because every street, every shelter, every broken building carried the same vibe. This heavy, tired hopelessness that clung to people like soot from the bombings. And even the weather seemed to be in on the misery, dumping snow and freezing winds over a population that barely had shoes, coal, or coats left to fight the cold. So folks were stuffing newspapers into their jackets and burning broken furniture just to keep frostbite from chewing on their fingers. And the trains, oh man, the train stations looked like scenes straight out of a nightmare. with refugees crammed into every corner, people sleeping on floors, families clutching suitcases and crying babies while trains screeched through carrying wounded soldiers, fresh coffins, and desperate civilians fleeing the Soviets, who were pushing forward with this unstoppable fury that scared the hell out of everyone who had even heard a whisper about what was happening in the East. And in the cities that were still standing, at least on paper, you'd see these long lines of hollow-eyed civilians waiting outside destroyed government offices for ration updates that were becoming cruel jokes, because the officials inside were sweating bullets, trying to explain why there was no bread, no milk, no fuel, no nothing, mumbling excuses about transport disruption or temporary shortages. Meanwhile, everyone knew the real reason was simple. The country was running on empty. Hospitals had turned into chaos zones too. Beds shoved into hallways, nurses fainting from exhaustion, wounded soldiers screaming in pain, doctors stitching wounds with thread so coarse it was practically rope. And somewhere in the corner of all that suffering, the propaganda machine kept cranking out its greatest hits, with Goebbels shouting through the radio about miracle weapons that were supposedly coming to save the day, even though the only miracle most Germans were praying for was a day without bombers. Families were breaking under the stress, marriages collapsing, kids acting out, old folks muttering about how they'd wished they'd never lived to see this madness. And the mail system was so busted that letters from soldiers arrived months late, or never arrived at all, leaving mothers pacing the floor at night, wondering if their sons were alive or buried under snow somewhere on the Eastern Front. The Nazi loyalists, what few were left, kept barking orders, trying to keep people in line with their little speeches about honor and sacrifice. But even they couldn't hide the panic growing behind their eyes, because every day fewer people saluted them, fewer people cared, fewer people believed the lies. And under that crumbling authority, small acts of rebellion started to appear. People turning off their radios when Hitler spoke, families whispering the truth behind closed doors, workers sabotaging machines at factories out of sheer exhaustion or quiet defiance, and old women openly asking party officials why they should stay loyal to a government that couldn't even feed them. The whole country felt like a frayed rope, one pull away from snapping. And as the snow kept falling over the ruins, blanketing destroyed homes and frozen corpses alike, Germany in late 1944 was living in a kind of slow-motion heartbreak, where people weren't dreaming about victory or ideology or pride anymore. They were just hoping to stay alive long enough to see the day when the bombs stopped, the shouting stopped, the fear stopped, and the world finally took its foot off their necks. Rolling into early 1945, Germany felt like it was standing on the edge of a cliff with both feet dangling over the drop, because the weight of the war wasn't just pressing on people anymore, it was crushing them flat. And every day felt like waking up inside a nightmare you couldn't shake yourself out of. The air raid sirens never seemed to shut up. Babies were crying from hunger. Old men were coughing in bitter cold cellars because their homes were blown apart months earlier. And mothers were patching clothes so many times the fabric looked more like a battlefield map than a shirt. And everywhere you went, the sound of distant explosions echoed like a grim reminder that the Allies were getting closer by the day. The Reich's leadership acted like reality was optional. Hitler ranted in bunkers, Goebbels spewed speeches about faith and loyalty, but the public wasn't buying it anymore. Their words bounced off the wreckage of shattered cities like empty echoes, because no speech could fill an empty stomach or rebuild a home that had been flattened into dust. Out in the streets, you'd see these long, shuffling lines of people carrying buckets to public pumps because the water pipes were destroyed. Women with cracked hands dragging sleds full of firewood scavenged from bombed-out buildings, and kids digging through ruins looking for anything useful. Buttons, wires, broken toys, anything that could be traded for food or fuel. And while all this was happening, the refugees kept pouring in, massive columns of families fleeing from the east with frostbitten feet and hollow stairs, pushing wheelbarrows piled with blankets, kettles, and the last pieces of their former lives. They were walking proof that the Red Army was getting closer, and the stories they whispered, executions, frozen bodies on the roadside, entire towns disappearing overnight, spread through German neighborhoods like a chilling wind that made even the toughest people's legs weak. Factories were collapsing from the inside too, workers starving, machines breaking, bombs slamming into supply lines. The war effort was basically running on adrenaline and denial. Schools had turned into shelters, hospitals had become overcrowded chambers of misery, and the black market was the only thing keeping people alive. Trading a pair of boots for a sack of potatoes, a family heirloom for a few pieces of coal, a wedding ring for medicine that might save a feverish child. The Nazi police kept pretending they were still in control, marching around barking orders, threatening people with arrests for defeatist talk, but everyone could see through it now. Those officers weren't powerful anymore. They were desperate, scared men trying to hold together a sinking ship with their bare hands. And through all this chaos, families tried to cling to whatever scraps of normal life they had left, lighting a candle at dinner, reading an old book to their kids, humming songs from better days. But even that felt fragile, like any moment another bomb could drop and erase whatever little piece of peace they had made. Germany wasn't fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting for the next hour, the next day, the next breath. And the people knew, deep in their bones, that the end was coming. Not with glory or triumph, but with the slow, grinding collapse of a nation beaten down by the very war it once cheered for.
By the time February 1945 clawed into Germany, the whole country felt like some massive abandoned factory still running out of habit, sparking and shaking, even though the gears were grinding themselves to dust, because every system, food, fuel, transport, medical care, basic sanity, was collapsing one after another, and the people trapped inside it were just trying to keep their heads above the tidal wave. Every train station was chaos, with refugees sleeping on cold floors, while wounded soldiers, wrapped in dirty bandages, limped off trains looking like ghosts who forgot how to be alive, and civilians crowded the platforms with suitcases full of what little they had left, hoping to escape to somewhere, anywhere, not yet blown apart. In the cities, entire neighborhoods looked like someone had run a giant bulldozer through them, rubble stretching as far as the eye could see, chimneys sticking out of the wreckage like broken fingers pointing at a sky that never stopped rumbling with Allied bombers. And when the air raids hit, the bombs didn't just destroy buildings, they shattered whatever was left of people's nerves, leaving them trembling in
cellars where the air was so stale and tasted like dust and panic. Kids covering their ears and crying, while the adults whispered prayers they weren't even sure they believed anymore. And the crazy part? Even with all this, the Nazi leadership kept pretending everything was under control. Hitler barking orders that made zero sense, commanding armies that didn't exist. Goebbels promising victory through sacrifice, while the only thing people were sacrificing was their health, their homes, and their last scraps of hope. And the propaganda stations played upbeat music like they could distract a starving population from the bitter cold reality sitting right outside their shattered windows. Meanwhile, desperate farmers were slaughtering their last cows in secret, terrified the government would seize them, and villagers were burying sacks of grain in the woods to hide from party officials, going door to door, demanding contributions to the war effort, even though everyone knew the war effort was like trying to refill the ocean with a teaspoon. And then there were the Volkssturm units, old men limping around with rifles older than they were, teenage boys shaking as they tried to look brave, mothers crying silently as their kids, barely old enough to tie their shoes without help, were handed weapons and told to defend the fatherland against seasoned Allied troops. Deep down, the civilians knew these kids weren't soldiers. They were casualties waiting to happen. In homes that still had walls, radios flickered with static, capturing pieces of broadcasts from foreign stations, and people leaned in close, terrified to get caught, but desperate to hear the truth about how fast the Allies were advancing. Some families started mapping the front lines on scraps of paper, watching the Allied forces push closer and closer until the line finally touched their own region, and that's when panic became a permanent resident in every household. You could feel it in the way women double-bolted doors at night, in the way men whispered as they repaired roofs that would probably be blown off again in a week, and in the way kids stared at the sky, flinching at every distant boom. Germany in early 1945 was like a giant with its knees buckling, trying to stand tall but collapsing 1 inch at a time, and the civilians, exhausted, hungry, scared out of their minds, were just waiting for the moment when the entire structure gave way and swallowed everything in its fall.
By March 1945, Germany wasn't just breaking. It was dissolving, like someone had poured acid over the entire country, and all the borders between military, civilian, order, and chaos melted into this one big cloud of fear and confusion that hung over every street, every village, every battered city block, because at this point, people weren't asking, "Will we win?" or "How long until victory?" They were asking, "How bad will the end be? And will my family survive the next 24 hours?" The Western Front was collapsing like a soggy cardboard box, American tanks rolling through towns faster than the German army could even retreat, locals waking up to the distant rumble of engines and realizing the war wasn't some distant thunderstorm anymore. It was at their doorstep, knocking with steel tracks and .50 cal machine guns, while kids peeked out shattered windows, unsure whether to be terrified or relieved that it wasn't Allied bombers leveling their neighborhood for the 50th time. And while the Americans pushed in with their columns of armor, handing out chocolate bars and cigarettes to civilians who looked like skeletons wrapped in rags, the Soviets on the Eastern Front were tearing through the Reich like a hurricane with a grudge, unleashing a wave of vengeance that terrified even people who had once believed Nazi propaganda without question. Refugees were still pouring in, stumbling over muddy roads with blisters bleeding through their socks, pushing handcarts with crying toddlers, whispering stories of Soviet artillery lighting up the horizon like rolling thunderstorms, of whole towns emptied overnight, of families separated in the chaos. And those stories twisted the mood of every German family into knots, because no matter where they lived, east, west, north, or south, everyone knew the end was closing in from both sides like two giant jaws snapping shut. Inside the remaining towns, you'd see scenes that felt almost surreal. Party officials shouting orders while packing their own bags to flee. Hitler Youth boys marching around pretending they were going to stop U.S. Shermans with Panzerfausts they barely knew how to aim. And civilians trading anything, coats, watches, wedding photos, heirloom silver, for one last loaf of bread or a sack of potatoes, because hunger had gone from a problem to a lifestyle. Cemeteries were overflowing, funerals happening with just 2 or 3 relatives because everyone else was either dead, missing, or too exhausted to walk. Hospitals had corridors filled with moaning soldiers missing limbs, wounded civilians with burns, infections, frostbite, and nurses on the edge of collapse, running on stubborn determination instead of rest. The black market was buzzing louder than ever. Cigarettes were currency, American rations were gold, and people passed around rumors like they were oxygen. The Americans are just 2 towns away. The Soviets crossed the river. The front is collapsing. Berlin is finished. Hitler has a new secret weapon, though everyone knew the miracle weapon talk was nothing but fairy dust sprinkled over a grave. Even in the countryside, where things had once felt calmer, reality had changed. American reconnaissance planes circled overhead. Volkssturm units dug pathetic trenches in frozen fields. Families hid valuables under floorboards, and everyone jumped at sudden noises, afraid it might be artillery or soldiers arriving unexpectedly. And through all this, you could feel a shift in the air. Defeat wasn't just expected. It was accepted, like a giant shadow slowly settling over the entire nation. And the German people weren't fighting for pride anymore, or for the Führer, or for the Reich, or any of that nonsense. They were fighting for their children, their last scraps of food, the final flickers of warmth inside a country that had become one massive, battered battlefield, waiting for the storm to finally swallow what remained. By April 1945, Germany wasn't even a country anymore, just a shattered skeleton of what it once pretended to be. A place where the streets were filled with smoke, fear, and the tired footsteps of people who had run out of tears long ago. Because everywhere you looked, the signs of collapse were written in plain sight. Berlin's skyline was nothing but twisted steel and burning rooftops. Volkssturm boys were dropping their rifles the second they saw Allied tanks. Families were waving makeshift white flags out their windows, hoping the soldiers marching in would show mercy. And even the hardcore Nazi officials were suddenly quiet, darting through side streets like scared rats trying to escape a ship that had already sunk. And when the Americans swept through the West handing out rations to starving civilians, when the British brought order to bombed-out towns, when the Soviets stormed Berlin with brutal force, the German people realized the truth that had been creeping toward them for years. This war wasn't ending with victory. It was ending with survivors crawling out of the ruins, brushing dust off their shoulders, and trying to understand how everything around them had been swallowed by destruction.
When Hitler finally took his own life in his bunker, it felt less like a dramatic finale and more like the last piece of a collapsing building finally dropping to the ground. No cheers, no relief, just this heavy, exhausted silence across the nation, as if the whole country let out one long, shaky breath after holding it for 6 brutal years. And when the surrender finally came on May 8, 1945, there were no parades, no fireworks, just families hugging each other in broken streets, kids searching for food among the rubble, old men staring at the horizon, wondering how they'd rebuild a life from nothing. And through that quiet, painful rebirth, the German people understood the cost of a war they never truly controlled. The hunger, the fear, the loss, the crushed dreams, and the weight of choices made by leaders they could no longer believe in. In the end, the story of 1944 through 45 wasn't about armies or borders. It was about civilians caught in a storm too big to escape, carrying a burden too heavy to set down, and trying with trembling hands to rebuild something human out of the ashes left behind. And that, folks, is the heavy truth of what life looked like for the German public as World War II came crashing down around them. Real people, real fear, real survival, caught between collapsing cities, starving families, and a war spinning completely out of control. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, if you learned something new, or if you just appreciate long-form storytelling that brings the past to life, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Your support keeps these powerful histories alive. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.